Our next speaker is Michael Mealing. He is our keynote today. Michael, okay, I'm going to read a quick bio here if you don't mind.
Go right ahead.
Joining us for our next presentation, we have Michael Mealing, a general partner at Starbridge Venture Capital. In his work at Starbridge, he focuses on finding and investing in companies whose products will play an important role in developing new commercial space activity. Much of his experience is in building solutions for markets that do not exist, including some of the internet's basic systems. In the early 90s, RFID enabled supply chain management in the early 2000s, and a groundbreaking commercial space company in 2005. Always at the forefront of innovation and technology, Michael is going to give us a glimpse into the development of the moon capital. Please welcome Michael Mealing.
Great, thank you. In addition to my role at Starbridge Venture Capital as a general partner, I am also the president of the Moon Society, as well as the CEO of the Waypaper Foundation, which is a nonprofit focused on human lunar development and settlement. In the remarks that I'm going to have today, I'm the guy that gets to be depressing because I'm talking about finance. And so some of the things I will say may be controversial, but they do come from, as we talked about yesterday, the pioneers are the ones that have the arrows in their backs. So without further ado, I'll jump into my slides, and I will definitely work on making sure there's time at the end, because I think some of the things I say may be a bit controversial. So first of all, if I'm going to be talking about lunar development and specifically the finance piece of it and why it's so hard. NASA recently did a venture capital study where they had about 20 VCs talking to them regularly. And those findings are going to be published tomorrow. And so there's a lot of interest both within NASA, STIPI, and the federal government to figure out how to augment the money that the government is putting in with private capital. And what I'll be discussing today is we really don't know how to do that. Right now, most lunar commercial development programs really do look like the underpants gnome business model. You figure out how to get to the moon, question mark happens, and then profit occurs. The problem is the question mark. We really don't know how to get there. So what I'm going to be talking a little bit is I want everyone who's listening to this to put on your investor hat, not your space fan or your my favorite infrastructure or even your government agency hat. Look at it in terms of your actual retirement portfolio. If you are presented by your advisor with the following stocks to put into your retirement plan, which one do you pick? The Tesla one looks great, but that's a one-year view. If you buy Tesla right now, that might not be the best idea. OKE looks kind of flat, but one of the things that is not in this view is the fact that it produces 10% dividends. So it may not be a growth stock, but is definitely an income stock. And depending on who you are and where you're at in your retirement, you'll be looking for income as opposed to capital gains. If you're looking for steady growth, then the XSW spider for technology stocks may actually make more sense. So now put on the fact that you are now trying to decide which one of these stocks to invest in for someone else, not you. They have a different risk profile than you do. And so that is the problem that currently the space sector has, is all of the people that you are asking to invest are managing other people's money. And that is a very different risk profile than we may prefer. So right now, the current lunar business model is Uncle Sam. You know, you can put a little ESA logo over in the corner, maybe a JAXA logo, but pretty much it's Uncle Sam. Going back to that list, if you had one of the portfolio companies in your portfolio that you're thinking about investing in, and Uncle Sam was the only customer, would you actually choose to buy that stock? And even if you did, how much of a portfolio would you actually allocate to it? Probably not very much. So some of you may have seen this. As a venture capitalist and as someone who invests in space companies, Starbridge only invests in space-related companies. A business model canvas is how we evaluate whether or not a company is real or not. It's very, very basic. Do you know what your value proposition is? Do you know who your customers are? Do you know how to reach them? Do you know who your competition is? And can you prove all of this? In order to fill out this business model canvas, you actually, if someone's doing their job right, you actually have to go out and talk to your customers, not sell, talk to and understand. Because the number one thing that any venture capitalist or investor is looking for is, have you discovered a problem that is so bad that someone's willing to give you bucket loads of money to solve? Sometimes that problem can be something enjoyable, like I would like to be able to go to France for the holidays. My wife and I do that usually, but right now I can't do that. If someone could guarantee me a way that I could go to the Christmas markets in Luxembourg, in France for the holidays and not get coronavirus, that's worth a lot of money to me. One of the things that's missing from the business model canvas is how your company relates to other companies, other customers, vendors, and that gets into how you create value and how your value proposition appears in the other company's way of doing business. So one of the things that we at Starbridge spend a lot of time on is looking at what's called the value network. Do you really understand the customer's problem? Does the customer actually think it's a problem? And more importantly, does the customer's customers think it's a problem? One thing that we see perpetually in the space industry is when these people are the same as these people. That is not a market. That's people selling the same thing over and over to each other, and no one actually generates profits. This is the current state of beyond LEO space commercialization. And that is really, really the challenge that I think we're facing. Is we talk about various things such as infrastructure, resource utilization, all these things, but at the end of the day, it really is one space company selling to another space company. Specifically, infrastructure for its own sake is not a market. Again, who is the customer? But one of the things that we really look for is who realizes the very basic value proposition. So for example, let's take Earth observation for example. There are emerging hyperspectral Earth observation companies that can really help out the agriculture business in terms of identifying crop diseases, malnutrition in the crops, water, whether or not the land is inherently arable or not. But the entity that realizes the actual value of that is the customer who's actually putting food on their plate. They are getting a better quality of vegetable, they're getting it for a lower price, and the access to that good is more reliable. When it comes to a lot of what we see in beyond LEO space commercialization, no one other than NASA is realizing that end final basic value proposition. And that's the other challenge. So getting at to that, one of the things that we hear is space resources justify the infrastructure for building out the infrastructure. So then we ask, okay, who wants those space resources? And we often get the answer of, it's the launch company that wants to be able to use that fuel from the moon to be able to launch elsewhere, which again is more infrastructure. I said, okay, who wants to launch something that requires that fuel? Well, the other company's building the space infrastructure. And again, you're back to the same cycle. Yes, infrastructure does lower costs if that's one of its goals. Right now, it's not clear that's one of its goals. It only gets that goal when the demand for the infrastructure is real. When we built the Intercontinental Railroad, there were resources and people and infrastructure on the other side of the continent that people wanted access to lower costs. The government wanted the ability to transport troops at a much lower cost. There were resources that people in the East Coast and in the West Coast needed that were in the middle of the country at a lower price. There were products that they could build out of those resources that didn't require on yet more resources, more infrastructure to exist. One of the other ones we see is space-based solar power, that we need all those resources if we're going to go build these big giant power sats. If you actually run the numbers, it is very, very difficult to compete with terrestrial power sources. Yes, even including the distribution and infrastructure costs, simply because of the upfront costs of building those power sats themselves. The only way it works is if some external entity causes terrestrial power to be inherently orders of magnitude more expensive. So what I'm trying to get everybody to do again is think like an investor, not as a fan of science fiction or your own startup or the future that we all like to see. Because the only way we're going to get people to pay for this is if we generate a return for them. And we have to understand the government wants a return of certain types. Individual investors want returns. Customers want value out of this. We have to understand that. And we have to understand that the returns that we generate are being compared to other opportunities that are not space related that may generate a better return for the country, the company, the individual. So you are always competing with someone else on whether or not this investment makes sense. So for the space sector, how do we go about solving this problem? If I was convinced that I had a surefire way of solving this problem, I would be out running a company trying to do it. This is a very hard problem. My hunch, and more people are starting to share this same hunch, is the only thing that justifies space infrastructure and the use of space resources is actual human beings. From the very beginning of the suborbital launch initiative back in 2004, we call them self-loading carbon units. They pay for themselves. They don't have to generate a return other than whatever personal motivations that human being has. LEO commercialization is actually developing. It may not happen as fast, but it is developing. Earth observation, communications, and in Starbridge's opinion, in space manufacturing, for use, even for use on Earth, those are all proceeding. Could NASA accelerate them a little bit? Yeah. Could Congress do some things to help support some more infrastructure in LEO? Sure. But I think we're going to get there. One of the interesting things that we do worry about, though, is no one out there is building what comes next, especially assuming, let's assume that Starship does fly. Hopefully flies this afternoon. Fingers crossed, yes. What do you do with that? That launch capability dwarfs anything that anyone currently has planned. Starbridge is an investor in Axiom Space, which is building a commercial extension to the space station. They're also flying space flight participants up to the ISS and are the ones actually involved in Tom Cruise's flight to film parts of his next movie. That's all being done on the Crew Dragon. What would you do with the additional capability of a Starship? And so far we see no one, possible with the exception of Axiom and Nanarax, that is being run by people capable of managing and building a billion-dollar business. And that's a skill. If you have not been around people that have done that, don't think you can just do that by reading a management book. That's leadership, that's personal skills. We don't see anyone with those capabilities standing up to take advantage of that capability. We need to find those people in those businesses. So in some of the conversations that we've had today, and Tim and I have talked about this, yes, development banks may have a role. Conversations with normal development banks, Macquarie, BlackRock, the big people that can write the checks that the government wishes they would write, they will not invest in something unless they can see proof of at least 10 years of the entities that they would be funding being able to service that note. If you can't show them that 10 years of note service, they require a government loan guarantee to even invest 1 penny. They also only do debt. There is such a thing as venture debt, but it's quite small. Debt is hard for a startup with an uncertain revenue stream. If you have to pay that monthly coupon, but you're only being paid by your customer once every 6 months, that is a very difficult cash management position. We need our debt service to flexibly match the revenue as it comes in. The government role as an anchor customer is necessary, but it is not sufficient. If you have an anchor customer, great. If that's the only customer, that's not an anchor customer, that is your entire market. We need non-government customer development beyond LEO, and that requires some form of demand generation. For example, one of the things that has been discussed in the National Space Council is the idea of a government supported strategic space propellant reserve, where the government acts as a buyer for water, methane, and a few other components that can be used to make propellants. The nice thing about methane is it's also a precursor for being able to make certain other carbohydrates, plastics. Demand generation is indeed one of the biggest challenges that we have right now. As I say, everyone is pushing the rope, but nobody's pulling the rope. And for the love of Pete, please stop building small launch vehicles. We also have far too many spacecraft component companies, especially in the electric propulsion market. If I see one more ion propulsion engine, I'm going to scream. Ways forward. So going back to the development bank idea. Yes, there within the several groups been something that we've been talking about for about 3 years now called we called it the Outer Space Private Investment Corporation, based on the idea of something called OPIC, OPIC, Overseas Private Investment Corporation, which has existed since the Nixon administration. 2 years ago, it was merged with USAID to form the federal government's U.S. development bank called the Development Finance Corporation. The Development Finance Corporation and OPIC originally actually returned money to the taxpayer. It made money for the U.S. government, and that money was put back into the treasury for use for other things. It self-funded itself. one of the key aspects of DFC is it is very careful about creating a firewall between the political process and the actual investment decisions and things it invests in. In the UK, there's the Catapult program, where the UK government created, I think, 8 different catapults, and one of them was the satellite catapult. And the actual investment decisions were made by investment professionals from the private sector. And they were compensated based on the performance of their investments, matching the thesis that was set up by the government, but it's now sustainable because it makes enough money. It returns value to the taxpayer in the UK. When you are talking about things like this within Congress, everyone in the Congress still remembers the political headache of Solyndra. Letting the government pick winners and losers is seen as a very bad thing on both sides of the aisle, because that's how graft occurs. That is the realm of rent seekers. You need that vacuum barrier between them. In the SpaceCom Expo virtual conference a little over a month ago now, Scott Pace actually mentioned that the Space Council had indeed been discussing the use of DFC and the Exim Bank as ways of funding certain space development efforts. If you as a space company are trying to develop something and your customers are outside the US, you can actually go to the Exim Bank for some financing. Even if you are sending data that you did in your Earth observation network and you are sending that and selling that overseas as an export, that's an export. You can get financing for those kinds of things. So yes, what we call OSPIC and what we call, whatever DFC does, the problem is when we talk to people in Congress about that, we hit a brick wall. And we're still trying to figure out why. It does appear to be, for the most part, everyone considers anything that the DFC would be funding to be so far in the future that it is not something that anyone currently sitting in Congress would ever have to deal with or get credit for. The statement that we get is, this is 500 years in the future. Why are you bothering me with this? And they literally do think it is 500 years. They do not think any of this is possible. In response to that, the National Space Society has developed and been working on a set of papers and a video that's on their YouTube channel talking about all of the actual funded and peer-reviewed science that says, no, this is actually possible and this is how you do it. And we are working with them on packaging that up and bringing that to Congress later on this coming Congress to show them that, no, it's not 500 years in the future. If you do some things right now, it can actually start within the next 5 years, not 500. Again, Congress is scared to death of any new large expenditures. But in the realm of public policy, there are sticks, there are carrots, and even then there are sermons. The way China does their 5-year plans is sort of interesting. I wouldn't suggest we do everything that China does. I wouldn't want to live there, but at the top level, they say, this is something that we want the country to do. We're not going to tell you how to do it. And they specifically talking about the provinces within China. But they do set up metrics that say, we will measure you based on how well you do meet these metrics. You have some provinces in China that choose not to participate in some of those things at all. They have other metrics they can be measured by. But someone in the Chinese government is going, these provinces are actually doing some of the things that we want to do. In the case of China, the usual result is a stick, not a carrot. And it's a pretty big stick. I don't think we want to carry that model, but there are ways that the federal government can come up and say, this is something that is the goal of this country. It is a bipartisan White House, Congress. We all want to do this, and we're going to start measuring people on whether or not they do that. Every government agency actually gets an annual yearly rating that is actually viewed by appropriations and viewed by their inspector general about how well they are performing to the metrics set by the federal government, by Congress and the White House. The other problem we face in Congress is when we talk about this, we get pushed back because of the fact that being an expansionist power is out of fashion. It's viewed as jingoistic, and it's viewed as quote unquote problematic depending on who you're talking to. The words you use matter. The Development Finance Corporation was created as a merger between OPIC and USAID as a direct response to China's Belt and Road Initiative. But nowhere on DFC's website or in the rhetoric would you have ever heard anyone actually say that out loud. Because you, again, don't want to give anyone else fodder for being able to blow it up by being claimed as jingoistic and confrontational. So we as an industry need to be able to talk about how do we be an expansionist power when it comes to the United States in space without using any of those actual words. Yes, that is very difficult. I don't know how to do it, but I think that's where we need to work on this. There are changes coming to the House and Senate. No one, given what we see with Richard Shelby, we don't expect him to run for re-election in 2022. There is some suggestion Eddie Bernice Johnson, who has been, has blocked several things on the House side, is also not running for office. So there's a lot of changes coming to space policy and how it's implemented in the House and the Senate. There are also some government incentives in terms of tax incentives that can help companies stay around longer. Venture funds, through the help of companies like mine and other venture funds out there focused on the space sector, are educating other investors about how to think about the sector and how not to be taken up by the hype. As a request, please stop the hype. Yes, tell the story, sell the sizzle, but do not lie. Investors know how to check, and we all talk to each other. And if we catch you making crap up, that's the end of that investment. And lastly, I think it goes back to everything that Tim has been talking about and we've been talking about so far. We need to make it politically acceptable to talk about large numbers of human beings, Americans living and working in space. Something that I've been floating around silently, just as a way to test people's willingness to think about this. Quote, "It is the policy of the United States that by the year 2040, there should be 5,000 US citizens living and working in space. To realize that goal, the US government will subsidize each person's first year's expenses by $5 million. It's a $25 billion expenditure, but that's just 1 year of NASA's budget. $25 billion when we were getting ready to spend 2.2 trillion on a pandemic response, yeah, it's kind of peanuts. But when you go to a congressman saying, can you give me $25 billion? Yeah, they're still going to look at you kind of askance. So again, think like an investor. Sorry to be such a downer, but these are the realities that we really do need to work through. And I'm more than happy to help any way I can. Starbridge is out here investing. Moon Society is ready to go, and Waypaver is here to help if you need help. Ready for questions.
Michael, thank you so much. I told one of my friends recently that there should always be a resident curmudgeon. And
that's Tom. That's
no,
not me,
right.
that's Tom.
Yeah. I used to have a guy on my team back when I was working on the Earth's space elevator, and he referenced himself as 51% convinced, right? Not all the way, just that little bit over the edge. No surprise, we still can't do that. But I'm going to put I said this the other day on, I guess, Monday. You've been in this field for a long time. You started out, bending metal, building small rockets that became larger rockets over a long time. You evolved, upskilled yourself into a kind of a different area, and then came back to the area that you loved. So you're not one of the newfangled venture capitalists that we see in Silicon Valley that are overwhelmed by the hype, right? You're not buying into the hype because you actually know the equations. You actually know the people. You actually have. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear that, but that just got really loud here. I'd like you to kind of, before we unpack your slides, and we will, I'd like you to go into the been there, done that, not screwing around experience that you've got that makes you an atypical VC. Because you kind of skipped that.
Sure. So there was a great tweet that I'm still trying to find. In the venture capital world, there are East Coast investors and West Coast investors. East Coast investors are very much about show me the money, show me the customers. I need a spreadsheet. Show me exactly what you're going to make, when, where, and how. And I will hold you to it. They have a lot of old money. They can write big checks. They also are more patient than West Coast investors. West Coast investors, they will say, what's the total available market? How big can this go? Yeah, we'll figure out the stuff to get there, but show me how big this can get and how fast we can get there. If you can show me that I've got a potentially $500 billion market and I can invest, 5 million now, and we can hit this market running in 6 months, right there. I don't need to see. West Coast investors will not look at a business plan. They will throw it in the garbage. I know certain investors that if you send them a business plan, that is their number one indicator to not invest. The idea and the decision should be something that can be encompassed in one sheet of paper.
Wow.
East Coast investors, exact opposite. I need to see the entire thing. You better share your entire Excel spreadsheet with me so I can go in and prove you wrong on your numbers. Starbridge, Stephen Jorgensen, who is the founder and my other general partner, he's from the Midwest. We go right down the middle. I get the potential. I get the fact that this is a multi-trillion-dollar human transformational business. But I still got to see the customers. Still got to see the spreadsheet. And that's because I've been in this business long enough to know that, and this goes all the way back to my involvement in the early internet in the late 80s and early 90s. Build it and they will come is not a strategy. It really is wishful thinking. Whenever you see someone do a build it and they will come from where it looks like that from the outside, no, they understand exactly where their market is coming from. They understand the timing of it. Jeff Bezos spent over a year analyzing hundreds of different markets that he could actually start Amazon out on. And he realized that books was the easiest one for various different and very specific reasons. His goal was to build Amazon to be exactly what he built it to be.
Right.
And it was not him going out and saying, I'm going to build Amazon and everybody will just want to use it. No, he was very methodical. So build it and they will come when it's successful is very rarely ever actually that under the covers. So yeah, as a venture capitalist, I've been on the other side
Right.
of hearing no, especially when I was trying to raise money for Mass and Space Systems.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Hearing no so much, it's so discouraging. I understand the pain that these entrepreneurs are going through. Been there. Missed a couple of payrolls. Had to do a potluck dinner for everyone so that we could make sure everybody got food.
Whoa, I never heard that story before.
I mean, that happens out there. You know,
Right,
the
yeah.
X-Corps had, Mojave was a family.
Yeah.
We made sure everybody was taken care of. So I see a lot of entrepreneurs coming into this thinking that it's easy. It is not. The vast number of these companies have failed, are in the process of failing, and it is a real challenge. So when you meet someone in the business that's running a space startup, give them a hug. They need it. But now, as I'm an investor, I'm going out. So the way venture capital works is I find other people that want access to the returns that we can generate, and I have to convince them for them to give me their money, and then I go invest it. So all those years of
You're
hearing
still
no,
asking for money.
I'm still asking for
part
money.
of that business model, right?
And I'm still hearing no.
Yep.
I'm hearing no less than I did. But if you talk to anybody in venture capital, especially somebody that's creating a fund from the very beginning, it's the same thing. You hear no. But the successful ones are the ones that understand the no, know how to respond to it, and know how to eventually overcome it.
So you know that the whole reason we've been doing this event is to focus on infrastructure, economy, jobs, near term. You glossed over it. I want you to hammer this point home. Why don't you want any more launch companies?
Because the market doesn't. Yeah, the market.
I need you to really drive home why we don't need any more launch companies to see.
Sure.
Yeah.
For two reasons. The reason the sub 500 kilogram payload market exists is because if your spacecraft is smaller than that, generally you don't want to pay for an entire Falcon 9 or an entire Atlas 5, and you don't have that kind of money, but you do want to launch at a particular time to a particular orbit. So if you can't afford a full Atlas 5 or a Delta or a Falcon 9, you have to ride along as rideshare, which means you're going to the orbit and on the schedule of the primary. So the value proposition for small launch vehicles is I'm more expensive on a per kilogram basis, but I launch whenever you are ready, and I launch only you exactly into the orbit that you want to go. So if the delta between the cost of being on a rideshare on a Falcon 9 versus flying on Relativity or Rocket Lab or any of the others is, 5 to 10 million. But if I'm going to fly on a rideshare and that's the only thing I can afford, but it's a 1.5 years wait, and even then I don't get into the orbit that I want to get into, yeah, I'll pay the extra 2 to 3x on a per kilogram basis launch price because that gets me to revenue faster. The problem is the number of companies that need that, they do exist. This market does exist. It does not support 140 of them. You are going to get a certain number that are built as part of being a quasi-nationalistic view where there was a saying that Scott Pace had at one point. Every country that wants to be a great power has to have heavy lift.
Yeah.
There is still the perception in a lot of countries that for us to be able to compete, we need a rocket. Oh, wait, NASA's doing this commercial thing. Oh, so we need a commercial rocket. A commercial rocket whose only customer is going to be government payloads because it's so damn expensive that nobody actually wants to use it. So there's a company, I can't pronounce the name, AGNIKUL in India, that is a small launch vehicle that's being encouraged and supported by Israel.
Right.
Commercial. It will probably get a bunch of government payloads.
Sure.
Will it be able to compete on the world skip market? I don't know. But beyond that, if you're trying to build a commercial launch vehicle in the sub 750 kilogram market, and you are not already flying or will be flying by the end of next year, you are so incredibly late to this market.
Right. Okay. So when we talk about infrastructure, we've really stretched the analogy of roads and highways and freeways. But it's a safe bet to say the launch market, we're good, right? Like we have what we need for the next 15 years, right? There's at least 7 reusable launch companies. There's probably another 5 that are credible on deck in the next 2 to 3 years, and that's just in the United States. If you look globally, there are several other reusable rocketry companies in development. Let's just say out of that 140, there's 20 that exist in the future, right? Okay, 20. Is that a realistic?
Realistic. There is a hole right now in most of what people are developing. The Dream Chaser covers this. You need gentle reentry.
Right.
Low G, both up and down. It's essentially
that's the down mass that Dr. Archer
right.
was talking about yesterday.
Right.
Yeah. Yep.
And so I don't know if anybody saw it, but there was a company that kind of sort of came out of stealth recently, Radian, with a rail launch content. They're, from reading that, they're going after gentle. It's the biz jet market for human launch. Cool. That's an underserved market, but I think the 2 companies, Sierra Nevada and Radian, if they can get their next rounds, nobody needs to be coming into that either. So.
All right. So where are the gaps then? I mean, you said there needs to be a killer app. Everybody wants there to be a killer app, but there isn't a killer app, right? That's what you're looking for.
Right.
So
it doesn't need to be a killer app, a mildly wounding app, something more than just NASA.
Okay.
Because I mean, when I originally started the internet in the late 80s, commercial companies were banned from the network.
Yeah,
you could
right.
not engage in commercial speech on the internet up until 1990, late 92, early 93. But even then, we all saw the potential of where to go. And what we needed was companies to start coming in and saying, okay, I'm gonna be in this space because like I can see where it goes in 20 years. But again, you need to be able to see where it goes in 20 years, and that's part of the problem.
Okay, so let's look back at the money then for a second, right? You mentioned DFI. We've talked about the developmental bank in a lot of different flavors over the course of today, yesterday, and the day before. You pointed towards National Society thought paper recently. Where do they fit in the financial ecosystem? Where do they fit in the financial ecosystem?
They fit just after, they come on board when you actually have your go-to-market strategy, where you actually have a product and you're ready to scale it to actually service customers. And so the role of equity, which is what venture capital does, where we buy a portion of the company and they take the money and use it to develop the product. So let's say in a rocket company, Rocket Lab, for example, or anybody else, they incur costs associated with a launch that they don't realize a gain on until they get paid by the customer after the successful flight, depending on their terms. So there's debt financing that goes into that. That's just financing your average, your cash flow, the use of debt. There are investment banks that will create lines of credit and different debt instruments for that. But those are generally short term. That line of credit, usually rotates every 1 to 2 years. When you're building something that has a longer time frame to build, that is outside of the 5 to 7 year debt stuff,
right,
and it's beyond the 10-year typical venture capital equity side, that's where development and investment banks come in for very long-term things. This is where, if you're building an airport or a seaport, where you're talking about significant infrastructure costs, buildings, companies, environmental concerns, dredging rivers, things that can take 10 plus years. These are groups that are accustomed to debt instruments that are 30 to 40 years long. So when people say, the investment world doesn't know how to think about long-term investments, no, they do.
Yeah.
They just have to have some, sense of whether or not you're going to be able to pay the damn bill. And that's the problem is they look at you and say, yeah, I could write you a 40-year note, but I see nothing here that shows how you're going to pay the bill every month.
So we've seen, we're going to have somebody talking about specifically not lunar mining, but the pieces before that. We're going to have somebody, Melissa, talk about that in a little while. But there's been arguments that Australia, because they have a really strong history in mining and in difficult, kind of hard environments of mining, that Australia should step in and start financing the development of, let's say, rare earth elements on the moon, because they've got this 40-year perspective and they know how to mine in difficult environments. So definitely Australia should be a player in the space mining, lunar mining business. So I think that's nonsense.
I do too, because nowhere in that entire discussion did I figure out who's going to be paying the, 100 times the current value per ounce of whatever you're mining to justify that. Okay,
so mining on the moon is hard. Let's just make that, put that out there. Business plans that rely on mining on the moon is hard. I'm not going to rule anybody out, but I'm just going to say it's not easy. But those 40-year perspectives, resource extraction, that is a model. That is a model that has proven itself long before we started thinking about going to the moon. That model has been in place a couple hundred years. So is there a way to bridge the science fiction of resource extraction? Today's science fiction, we're capping this thing in just a few years. Is there a way to untap the resource community capital sources to go after this? And now this is speculative, right? This is a speculative conversation.
No.
You're trying to show up. Are you trying to bring up your slides?
Yeah, let me get back to it. Space resources only make financial sense in space.
Okay.
Right. So, yes, as soon as you get any company that has a customer that's willing to pay for those space resources, And you can, even if that company is a government entity,
Right.
and there is some, for example, one of the things that the Overseas Private Investment Corporation provided was political risk insurance. If you're doing a deal in another country and the government decides to back out, that's an insurance policy that OPIC will sell you. So if someone stands up and says, yes, I will buy this, and I am committing this amount of money, and it's a credible statement, and there are real commercial contracts on it, yeah, you can find somebody to fund that all day long.
Okay.
You'll have a bit of a challenge early on, depending on how the amortization of the note works and what the coupon payment looks like, about what your cash flow is either over and above that. So you may be dipping into the note, its principal itself,
Okay.
to finance your first payments on it. But yeah, that is something that the investment banking and development bank world has been doing for a very, very long time.
Okay, so that's far out. We're not going to do that anytime soon, right? Because we're not going to have those kinds of contracts, because we're not going to be able to do that technology just yet. Keeping in that 2022, 2025, and 2035 timeframe, let me flip it around.
In the 2035 timeframe, I definitely do think that's the case.
Say again?
In the 2035 timeframe, I actually do think that's the case.
Oh yeah, we will have that. You're saying we will?
I think so, in some form, yes.
Excellent. Really glad to hear that. I was going to ask a different question, but let me explore that a little further. I've asked people and put them on the spot about the crystal balls recently. What does 2022 look like near term? What does 2025 look like pretty near term? And then if your two predictions of those two dates work, what does 15 years out look like?
This is the challenge we had in writing the ISP recently. Is Starship is such a inflection point. It's very difficult to predict what comes after that. 2022, I don't think much is going to change. I think the Biden administration is going to keep things going as they are. I do suspect that Starship will fly sometime in 21. If not, I mean, full stack, the entire thing will fly sometime toward the end of next year. And there will be some very difficult questions in Congress, and some people will be called on the carpet.
I have referred to Starship as a singularity point, not just an inflection, but an actual singularity where we can't predict what happens after that event. That's me saying it's not just an inflection, but a singularity that is unpredictable past that.
I can predict a little bit from, let's say it flies next year, 22 and 23. I do think SLS doesn't get canceled. However many cores for engines they have, because nobody wants that much unemployment in Northern Alabama.
Right.
But I predict that for the first 2 years that Starship exists, no one's going to have a damn clue what to do with it.
Right. Right. I mean, it is capacity at a level that we really don't even understand yet. Let me take it back way closer to home, though. We've got some folks on the call that are actively trying to build space companies. I'm one of them. There's some other folks on this call. What do you write checks for? Forget all the big stuff, the big, ambitious, audacious, aspirational stuff. What do you write checks for in January?
I'm still doing Earth observation. Communications is half of our portfolio. We do think that hyperspectral imaging is going to change a lot of things. SAR. There's a lot of other EO kind of technologies that people are only just now getting their heads around. Commercial data purchase is becoming more accepted. Mm-hmm. Communications, everybody talks about laser-based communications, but still nobody's doing it yet.
No, it's super hard.
Yeah, pointing accuracy necessary to maintain beam lock is really hard.
Super hard.
Yeah, especially when you're trying to do it off of just, commercially available reaction wheels. That's hard. So one of the things at Starbridge is we invest in things that enable other things in the future. So that was our investment in Axiom.
Say that again. We enable, I want to hear that one more time.
We invest in things knowing that they're going to enable other things in the future. So the way a venture fund works is we create a new fund every year and a half, 2 years. That has a new set of investors and it has a new pot of capital and it goes out and makes investments. Unlike a lot of other venture funds that just simply respond to companies' investment opportunities that the market provides, we do things now knowing with the idea that they're going to pay off later. And so, yeah, that's some of the things we do. So there's, for example, we're an investor in a stem cell based meat company because we know that for human habitation in space, you're not actually going to bring a cow.
Surprisingly, yeah.
Right.
So that makes you almost a builder of platforms. It's not just about the company, it's the platform that enables whatever happens next.
Right. That's why we invested in Axiom, because if you want to do real space in space manufacturing, the ISS is not capable of being that.
Okay. When you evaluate your plans, loud and clear, don't lie, right? Because it's a small network of, I'm gonna say there's two kinds of space investors. This is me saying it, not you saying it. I'm going to say that there's the space investors that got into it within the last 3 to 5 years because it's the cool new sexy. And then there's the folks who've been around for a generation that have been burned a long time, several times, right? And they come at it from different perspectives. When you built Starbridge, what were you trying to enable from that perspective of been around for a while? What were you trying to, what's the end goal of Starbridge?
The end goal in Starbridge is for everybody in the company to be able to move the company headquarters out into space permanently and never come back. Nice. Now, the problem that we saw, the reason why Starbridge exists is because there was a gap in the Series A level. You could find enough angel investors to get somebody over the initial kind of, yeah, you can do it. But when they went out to raise real money, there were no professional money managers that understood the sector or the business.
Right.
So that's our goal. In some cases, we may not have the money to be able to just to make the whole investment ourselves, but we can bring in other investors because we can tell the story.
And does we've got a 1 minute answer on this. Does this proposed development bank make it easier for y'all to write checks to be that bridge?
Yeah, and especially if one of the things that if it's set up right, especially the way the UK did it, you would see several of these space specific VCs and other types of money managers step up to provide that service to that bank for evaluating that. So yeah, the idea is whether it's us, Space Fund, Space Capital, or anybody else, we would be going to that development bank, that DFC, and say, we want to be one of your professional money managers. Here's our track record. Here's how we make decisions. We will implement your thesis, and we will make sure that we share the vision of getting where we want to go.
And then by this de-risk tool, it makes it easier for you to go back to investors that have maybe been lukewarm, your investors, right? Maybe you've had a couple lukewarm conversations with folks because the risk is too high and they can invest in Tesla instead. Instead, they might come invest with you.
That, and it also tells them that the federal government is committed to this in the long term.
Right.
Because they understand that NASA's budget is a year by year thing. But an entity like this, is built to invest in and realize a very long-term commitment.
Perfect.
OPIC was created by the Nixon administration.
Thank you very much, Michael. Really, really appreciate your experience. I'm glad you're on our side, even if you are one of our resident space curmudgeons. We're going to pass it over to Lila. Thank you very much, Michael. Really appreciate your time. Please put your links down in the chat. There's some folks that want to get in touch with you.